I'd like to welcome you all to our first ever webinar. We're all getting used to a new normal at the moment, and this is actually my first webinar. I've not mentioned that to Jonathan, so I hope I haven't scared him away. So yeah, I'd just like to welcome Jonathan Walters, Deputy CEO at the RSH. He's kindly agreed to provide us with an update from the regulator, as well as insights about the operating environment as we kind of stand blinking in the light as we go forward. I am actually pleased to say that all the speakers from our doomed annual conference have agreed to speak at our series of webinars in May, including the Ombudsman, CIH, DWP, and Oaks. So if you haven't booked a place on the other webinars, just go to our webpage and get yourself booked on. Before I just hand over to Jonathan, in time-honoured fashion, I've got to do the boring housekeeping issues. The webinar is scheduled to last for an hour. If it doesn't last an hour, that's fine. It does depend to some extent on your questions. If you need to access your audio controls to test your speaker or earphones, just click on the chevron next to the mute button on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And then you just need to click test speaker and microphone. But you won't need your mic because we've switched your camera and your mic off at our end because, well, basically the simultaneous chinking of teacups is likely to drive us all balmy. So if you do have a technical issue though, Mark's sitting there with us, just use the chat function on the toolbar to contact Mark and he'll work behind the scenes to sort your tech problem out for you. Jonathan's going to go through his briefing theme by theme at a kind of natural pause points between themes. We're going to stop for questions. So can I ask you to use the Q&A function again at the bottom of your screen to post written questions. Both me and Jonathan will be having a look at them as they come in, and we'll be sifting through, and I'll be putting as many questions to Jonathan as possible verbally. We're happy to say that a recording will be made of this, so you'll be able to watch it again for all the bits that you missed first time around, as well as point your colleagues in the direction of this. Hopefully this will be a useful resource for people that can't make it today. Finally, if you do hear a fire alarm, that'll be the kids in the kitchen doing chemistry experiments. So without further ado, over to you, Jonathan.
Great. Thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone for making the time to come. It's great to see you all. Well, to hear you all at least. What I'll try and do is talk through a few themes that we as a regulator have seen as we moved into lockdown, and I'll talk about how we've changed our approach, what we're seeing from the sector, and then we'll maybe pause there before we get on to kind of what for me is a big question at the moment, which is what does lockdown look like as we emerge from it? What does the next stages look like? And maybe talk about some of the political things that we think might follow the ending of lockdown. So, was it 6-8 weeks, I think, since we went into lockdown? The sense we get now is that the sector as a whole is kind of engaged in a new normal. And certainly for the first 2 or 3 weeks, I think everyone was kind of going, well, how on earth do we run a housing business given the restrictions that are being put in place? You know, what's the right level of repair service we should be offering? What about gas safety? You know, what's the regulator going to do if we can't get into properties that we would normally want to get into? All of those sorts of kind of operational questions really dominated the early part of the lockdown phase. The sense we get now is most organisations have got their heads around how they run the service they need to run in lockdown. So lots of people are working from home. Frontline operatives, I think what we saw was initially was a real spike in self-isolation and in illness rates to begin with at the start of the crisis. The message we're hearing back and interesting people's views is that now has changed, and sickness levels and presence at work levels are back to roughly where they would be, maybe a little bit higher than long-term averages, but in general where they were previously. And the sector as a whole, and these are broad brush generalities, but the sector as a whole is managing to deliver an emergency repair service and is attempting, insofar as is possible, to meet statutory compliance requirements, whether that's gas safety, fire risk assessments, electrical safety, all of those kind of statutory things that you're obliged to try and carry out. People are trying to deliver those services where they can, but clearly they are operating in an environment where some tenants are self-isolating or do not wish other people to enter into their homes, which is completely understandable. And you may have operatives who are either self-isolating or unwilling to go into homes. And what that then throws into sharp relief, I think, is access to things like PPE. Have you got the right equipment to allow operatives to go into homes where they have to? And some of the issues we're hearing around consistent access to PPE, which can be quite variable. Certainly the cost of PPE has gone up considerably. And also there is often a mismatch between what tenants would expect of someone entering into their homes, which may be quite high end in PPE terms, and what is actually advised by the Public Health England and the health authority, which might actually be quite low level. You know, it might be as simple as a face mask, gloves, possibly a visor, and not too much else. And we've certainly, there's been tales of certainly a story in the Sunday Mirror a couple of weeks ago of, you know, a tenant complaining they wanted someone in a hazmat suit and someone turned up with a face mask and some gloves, and they didn't feel that was appropriate. Why they felt it was appropriate to talk to the Sunday Mirror is a different question, I think. But there's definitely been some of that mismatch going on. And similarly, we hear that operatives are often asking for a higher level of PPE equipment than, again, is recommended by Public Health England or other medical authorities. So there are some real operational challenges that we wouldn't want to underplay, and actually maintaining that supply of PPE has been really difficult, and again, that's been a real challenge. And clearly, as you will know from the themes we've been concentrating on as a regulator, we recognise that within the care and supported housing parts of the sector, those challenges are perhaps even more acute than in general needs, where you have no option but to regularly access people's homes because of the level of support or care that they need. And they're maintaining PPE and gaining access to testing where that is needed has proved problematic and difficult for organisations. And we as a regulator have been out talking to care and supported housing organisations on a fairly regular basis. And some of you may have seen this morning, we published the result of our first cause survey. So that's the kind of monthly sentiment survey we're carrying out during the coronavirus period to understand how well organisations are coping with some of the operational challenges, so not the financial challenges, but the operational challenges. And the survey that we've put out today reflects all of the things I've just been talking about, which we were getting back anecdotally, but now we have some kind of statistical evidence that says the sector appears to be coping well, but there are some real challenges in the areas I've just talked about. So in response to that, we as a regulator have considerably flexed our regulatory approach. Now, I know some of the people on the call will be less than 1,000 homes, and this won't affect them as much as those with more than 1,000 homes. But there are changes we've made across the board, I think, to try and help people. So we've currently paused the IDA programme. So we finished off IDAs remotely where organisations wanted us to do so. And we're just beginning to have a conversation internally about when will be the right times to restart the IDA programme. So again, very interested if people have views on those sorts of things. The financial forecast return, the 30-year forecast we want from larger organisations, we've put on hold because frankly, we all think it's really hard to work out what a long-term financial forecast looks like in the current environment. And again, the Bank of England have been out this morning talking about a 30% drop in the economy, which is just unprecedented. And quite how you work through that and what you think that says for the sales market. Maybe we'll cover it later on in the webinar. But we've decided that's not appropriate to get in. Sort of quite detailed SDR return, which is normally due in at the end of May. We said we'll want that at the end of October to give people a bit of time and capacity to focus on other things if that's what's needed. And on accounts, we've basically extended our accounts deadlines by 3 months to give people a chance to pull their audits and their accounts figures together. So where we can as a regulator, we've tried to pull away from direct regulation and moved into a kind of more supportive stance than perhaps we would do normally. So we aren't looking for outright compliance with all the standards at the moment. We're not looking for the type of assurance we normally look like. We're using the cause survey to get a sense from people. Are they coping with the challenges operationally? And if they're not, can they let us know? And then can we work with them to try and address whatever those particular set of issues were? And again, for the smaller organisations on the call, you'll know you all received a letter hopefully last week from our Chief Exec, Fiona McGregor, setting out some of that thinking and saying, look, we know there are big challenges. If you're a small organisation, some of those challenges may be disproportionate to your size. If you are struggling with some of those challenges, come and talk to us. We have offers of help from larger organisations operationally and financially, and there are other packages of measures of support we could possibly put in place if people are feeling really challenged on the operational side. So we are trying to work with the sector and support them through what we accept are unprecedented times. We think so far all the evidence we're getting is that the sector is adapting and coping really well, and I think that's been noticed across government. There's a real sense that the sector has stood up and delivered really high quality services in really trying conditions. So far so good, I think, and maybe later on we'll come on and talk about what the challenges might look like as we begin to emerge from lockdown. But Steve, I'm just going to pause there because that's kind of covered some of the operational issues that we've been grappling with and the sector's been grappling with, and see if there are any questions on that before I move on to the financial issues. I think you might be on mute, Steve.
Yeah, that was me trying to be professional and sort of mute things while you were talking. Yes, we've had no questions come in yet, but I've got one for you. I'm conscious you've got, the regulator's got a coronavirus landing page for that provides updates on how you're flexing the approach to regulation. And I think I saw something on there a couple of weeks ago about gas certs falling out of time, whereas in the past, obviously, any potential breach of the standards, you'd be expecting providers to be getting in touch with you straight away. So are we saying that a few falling out of time is okay for the time being?
So yeah, so what we're saying is, first thing we're saying is follow the HSE guidance, and the HSE, I think, over the past 6 weeks has evolved its guidance quite a lot. So the first thing to do is to make sure you've looked at what the latest HSE guidance is, and some of the case studies they've put on their website, which I think are really helpful. So I think going into this, because obviously the gas safety point is that they own the requirements around gas servicing, not us. So you try and follow the HSE guidance. What the HSE have started saying actually is they also accept there may be situations where you can't get into a property because of the operational challenges we were talking about earlier, but you should be trying. So the response that's not acceptable is that you simply don't try and carry out a gas servicing program. But we, I think, and the HSE accept that there will be situations where you can't get in as quickly as you would want to because the tenant is self-isolating, or has coronavirus, or has very deep concerns about letting operatives in to carry out that work. So there may be situations where you can't keep your gas certificates up to speed. What we as a regulator, I think, want is for people to record where they've made decisions. So in what circumstances are you going to choose to not try and pursue entry into that property? Because clearly you could go to the courts, you could try and gain entry, but that might be very heavy-handed, it might be inappropriate on the balance of risk, that might not be the right thing to do. And we don't think there's a right or wrong answer in each individual case. There'll be a balance of risks and a balance of issues for you to think about. And what we're saying is don't tell us each time you can't gain entry or can't deliver it. The core survey is the way to tell us about how overall you're managing. And we're hearing a really mixed picture. We've got some organisations telling us actually, because everyone's at home, they're gaining access much more easily, and their rates are probably about where they are normally. Other people are saying actually we've got some really frightened and concerned tenants and they simply don't want anyone in, and our operatives are struggling. You know, we're only getting into 20% of the properties we try and gain entry to. So we're seeing a really mixed picture across the country, and we're not trying to say that one of those is right or wrong, but what we are trying to say is think about how you make those decisions, how you document them, so that you understand why you've done what you've done. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. And just in the same vein, we've got Mark Jackson from Lambeth and Southwark is just asking, have you sort of got wind of any progress in terms of extending gas certs? You know, there was some talk of it following the same lines of MOT tests. Yeah,
so there's definitely a move in some quarters to put pressure on the HSE to do that and extend it to 18 months. Now, I am not an expert in gas servicing and gas safety, so I genuinely don't know whether 18 months would be completely inappropriate, whereas 12 months is acceptable. And is 15 months okay, but 18 months not? I'm just not an expert, and I would. We as a regulator are not campaigning one way or another on that, because we're not gas safety experts. So the sense I get is it's not that guidance is not going to change, but it's not our call. It's not our call to make. What we have been clear about is we're not going to follow that up as a serious detriment issue, as long as people are doing what they think is the right thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it's not that you've heard anything in the pipeline for moving on to an MOT basis. Okay.
Yeah.
Just a few others coming in, just on the accounts. Can you, this is from Peter Moore down in Cornwall, can you clarify the date accounts are due, assuming March year end? Yeah,
sure. So the first thing to say is there's more than one set of deadlines and sets of requirements. So our deadline that's set out in statute is you have to supply accounts to us within 6 months of the year end, which for March will take you to September. What we have said as a regulator is we can't change our primary legislation. There's nothing in the legislation that allows us to slip or change that deadline. But in a sense, we're the only ones that care whether they come in on time or not. And normally we regard late submission of accounts as quite a serious issue, because it's normally an indication of other issues going on at that organisation. We have said we recognise at the moment, for a whole variety of practical and other reasons, it might be difficult to get the accounts into us by the end of September. And therefore, we would not start taking any regulatory action for non-submission of accounts until 3 months after that period. So that takes you to the end of December. So we're not going to start ringing people up and chasing them for their accounts until 9 months after their year end.
Right, okay.
So that's our set of requirements. If you've got loan documentation though, and if you've got a loan, the loans may well say you have to submit your accounts to the lender within, it's normally actually 180 days, which is not quite the same as 6 months, but there's normally a date by which you have to send your accounts to your funders, and if you don't send them to your funders in that time, that is a breach of a loan covenant and all the things that flow from that. So we can't change what's in your loan document. That's a commercial document between you and your lender. So you need to talk to your lender about, are they offering any flex or not, or are they still expecting those accounts to be in by the time that's specified in the loan documentation. Clearly, by us extending by 3 months, we're trying to send a signal and apply some soft influence, if you like, to say to people that we as a regulator can live with them 9 months after the year end. Therefore, you might want to think about what that means for you. But these are independent commercial organisations that you borrowed from. They will have their own, commercial pressures and reasons to want to get the accounts in. And we can't change that.
Right. Okay. So, and I guess there might be other requirements as far as, say, the Charities Commission and obviously Companies House as well that people need to consider.
Yeah. So depending on, exactly. So the legislation for companies is quite flexible and actually there is provision within the legislation to allow Companies House using a Secretary of State power to flex the year end, and they've done that. So for companies, they have been given an optional 3 months additional extension. The FCA and we, in our legislation, don't have the power to amend what's written into the primary legislation. So the primary legislation says 6 months after the year end, but there's no mechanism in the legislation that allows us to flex that for community benefit societies. There is for Companies House, for Companies Society, Company Act companies. So that's why the Companies House can be a bit more flexible than we in the FRC can be.
Right, okay. So just for the avoidance of doubt and for Imtiaz in Leicester, it's not, as far as getting the extra leeway from yourselves is concerned in terms of getting the accounts in, it's not a case of asking for consent from yourselves. It's more of a case of you're not going to be hassling people for 3 months.
That's right, yeah.
September.
We effectively said we won't start chasing anyone until 9 months after the year end.
Yeah, brilliant, excellent. Just one final one on these kinds of operational issues. Again, it's from Mark down in Lambeth. Any clarity around undertaking void works? Is it purely a matter for each provider, or does the regulator have a view?
The regulator doesn't have a view. The government put out some guidance last week on lettings, and clearly with the announcement we're expecting on Sunday, that may say a bit more about I'm not sure it won't be about lettings and voids work, but it'll set a tone, I think, within which the government will look to deal with lockdown issues and emerging from lockdown. So there may be some more clarity, but we don't have a view. That's an independent decision, I think, for individual organisations.
Yeah. Okay. So very much based on reasonableness of the circumstances.
Yeah.
Okay, that's brilliant. I think we should crack on. Okay.
So we were just talking about accounts. So financially, so we talked about the operational challenges that come from coronavirus. There clearly are, given the economic picture backdrop as a result of the lockdown, there are some economic challenges for housing associations as a result of coronavirus and the sustainability of the HRA from local authorities. So the first of those clearly is around rental income, and will rental income be maintained? And all the information we have had so far is that rental income has held up. So we've not seen the spike in bad debts and arrears that we were expecting. Now, I'm not sure that will be maintained. I think, we've 2 million new universal credit claims that are going through. I can see over time arrears and bad debts may start to climb again. And there's a great deal of concern among some landlords that the 3 months sort of moratorium on evictions might lead some tenants to choose not to pay their rents, given some of the other pressing financial concerns they might have, and therefore you might again see an uptick in arrears. Again, speaking to most landlords, we're not seeing that, but clearly there might be challenges around that kind of cash flow. I don't know how relevant it will be to people on the call, but one of our big concerns is clearly the housing market is frozen. You can't buy or sell a property at the moment. If you had a business plan that involved selling properties, whether that's new build or just disposing of your own stock, that's not going to happen in the current climate. And we don't know how long the housing market will be in deep freeze for, but the longer it's in deep freeze, the more associations are going to miss some of those big capital cash flows that they had expected. And certainly there was a period early on in the crisis where the funding markets were more or less shut, and it was actually incredibly hard to raise any money for a week or so, whereas now the funding markets appear to be open. But however this crisis plays out, we might go through another period where it's hard to raise money. So those kind of cash flow concerns are quite high for us. Having said that, the information we've got from landlords suggests as a whole is very liquid, does have quite a lot of money, rental income's holding up. But as of today, we're not as worried about the financials at the moment, I think all of us think that could change. And in some sectors like care and support as well, there are issues around voids, and if unfortunately you do start generating or voids start happening as a result of coronavirus related deaths in care homes or supported housing schemes, at the current time it's not necessarily straightforward to replace those people and bring new tenants in. And I think in that context you can begin to see void rates climbing in those areas. So that's that will be a real challenge, I think, for some landlords. But by and large at the moment, and we'll talk about what post-lockdown looks like, I think that's when the real challenges will come. But at the moment in the deep freeze, it feels to us that the sector is financially okay. Where I think the challenges will come actually is around the accounts. So there are potentially some big numbers in your accounts that may be affected by coronavirus. So particularly if you've got unsold stock, or if you happen to own some land, if you have a development planned, the value of that might have to be written down in the account. So what impact would that have on you if that were the case? If you've got a pension deficit and there's a pension revaluation, there are clearly issues around what you record in the accounts. But also I think, and we've been talking to auditors quite a lot about that this year, is the going concern test will be quite challenging this year for housing associations. So the audit profession was already under a lot of pressure over going concern tests, even before coronavirus, because of what happened at Thomas Cook and Patisserie Valerie and other kind of accounting scandals, if you like, where it was felt the auditors hadn't spotted the weaknesses in the business and flagged that to the users of the accounts. So they were already upping how tough the going concern test was going to be. I think in the post-coronavirus world, that going concern test will become even tougher. So I think you should expect to be challenged by your auditors. Basically, they should be challenging you and saying, how well can you cope with, a prolonged lockdown, a housing market freeze, rental income you know, not coming in as you would expect? How well will your business flex with those things? And you shouldn't be afraid of, you know, having a, you know, arguing back, and they'll expect you to be presenting a good case back to them. And to be honest, this sector still looks far safer than almost any other sector in the UK economy. This is not hospitality or leisure or travel or anything like that. So you're still quite a robust sector. So compared to what the auditors are seeing in other sectors, this will still look fairly robust, but they will be, I think, challenging. And associations who are probably used to having not an easy ride in their audit, but a reasonably straightforward audit, will probably find it's a more challenging process this year, and people should be ready for that when it happens. So we think there are some challenges that flow from coronavirus, but I'll talk about a few more when we get on to the kind of emerging from the deep freeze point. But I'll pause there, see if there are any questions from any of that.
No questions specifically on that. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to chuck in my question about the sense that you're getting from Whitehall and Westminster about how ministers and civil servants think the sector's responded, and whether that might help improve a slightly fractious relationship.
So I mean, you've heard me say this many times, Steve. The sector has no natural friends politically. I think, you know, just in very broad terms, for the right, you're too much like the public sector, and why aren't you more commercial? And to the left, you're not enough like councils, and why aren't councils providing these homes directly? You know, in broad caricature terms, but that does mean the sector doesn't have any real natural political allies. And I think, you know, the Conservative government that came in at the beginning of December, I think it is naturally a home ownership promoting, you know, right-wing government, and I don't think there are any bones about that, and that would be their agenda. And they would, you know, I think they recognise the need for social housing, absolutely, but I think their priority will be how do we promote home ownership. So I think a bit like Grenfell did, though, the coronavirus has really shone a light on how much society is dependent on, you know, key workers, people who work in factories, delivery drivers. There's a whole range of, you know, key parts of society that actually keep the country going. And guess what? It turns out they're not bankers, lawyers, and regulators. It's you know, it's people doing proper jobs, if you like, that are keeping the economy going. And I think that has changed the political discourse. You know, nationally, you see that in the papers, and clearly there's a big focus on NHS workers, but I think there's a recognition that we're all now dependent on our drops from delivery drivers for all sorts of things that normally we would have brought in another way. So I think that has changed the terms of the debate. And I think one of the really interesting questions as we emerge from lockdown, and there are lots of people back talking, this is going to be kind of like a 1918, 1945, you know, realignment. There needs to be a new social settlement arising out of coronavirus, given what's happened and how the state has suddenly expanded. So 1 in 4 people is now currently on the furlough scheme or employed by the state. You know, the state's involvement in the economy is much bigger under a self-avowed right-wing chancellor and you know, prime minister. That's a really interesting place to be, and I think that dynamic and how we emerge from lockdown and what that means for the economy, what that means for what the state does, what that means for what the private sector does, all of that, it feels like it's up in the air. But I think the sort of people that the sector generally provides homes for are the kind of people that government and the press and the general public are now realising are actually crucial to keeping the economy going. And I think that allows for a different type of discussion, which we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think the sector should really be thinking about how do we play into that discussion, and not just in the way that is give us more grants so we can build more homes, because that will go down really poorly. But I think the sector saying, look, we can really help you with homelessness, we can really help you with rough sleeping, we can really help you with housing some of these people who are keeping the economy going. And there's a whole package of things that we could do. We can give you things, but we can do even more if you give us some things, but you lead with supporting your tenants rather than leading with, you know, give us more grant to do X, Y, or Z. I think there's a really fruitful conversation to be had.
Well, I think that's really useful, and sort of following this vein, hopefully if the government might be a bit more receptive to us now, can you imagine, this is from Jim Aspidin, are we likely to see further rent reductions? Because some people would argue that's a way of levelling up, is leave more money in people's pockets.
Yeah, it is fascinating. The sector is, like, this comes up in almost every conversation I have, the sector is, and I understand why, the sector is completely, I don't know what the right adjective is, concerned, shall we say, about another set of rent cuts. And I get that given what happened in 2015. But we're picking up none of that in this context. And actually, I think for the government, they will need a post-coronavirus stimulus package. You know, and the housing market is not going to emerge from the deep freeze and just carry on as though nothing happened. I think there are going to be profound changes in the housing market as a result of this. And I think the role of social housing providers in keeping the economy going in terms of construction, supply chains, all of those things as we emerge from coronavirus, I think is recognised in government. And there is a fairly well-established post-downturn playbook I suspect government will use again about using housing associations to keep the construction industry going before the volume house builders, you know, start moving again. And I think in that context, cutting rents would be very counterproductive, because although that, you know, there may be grant going into that, there will also be quite a lot of private debt going in. And if you keep cutting rents, lenders and rating agencies will notice that, and you will lose one of the great benefits of the housing association sector from the government's perspective, which is you can borrow cheap money off balance sheet and use it to deliver objectives that the government has. And I don't think they'll want to cut across that. So I'm going to live to regret this now, aren't I? I'm going to look foolish in however many years' time when rents are cut. But I genuinely, there is no talk at the moment that I'm hearing about rent cuts, other than people in the sector getting scared that government's going to cut rents.
Right. I think I just heard 70 sighs of relief there. Yeah, just a quick question from Susan French at Barnsbury down in London. Many housing associations are starting to try and reimagine what their services look like based on what they've learned over the last few weeks. Do you guys, does the RSH have a view on long-term changes to services as a result of this?
So, well, we are certainly doing some thinking about that. So what we don't have is a view that services must change in this or that way. So we don't have a view that actually we should use this to achieve X or Y, because basically that's not our job. We're not given that job by Parliament to try and shape the sector and make it behave in or reshape in certain ways. So we haven't got that view, but we regulate the sector, so we want to be kind of ahead of that debate and discussion. So we're doing quite a lot of thinking about, well, what does this mean? And we're out talking to organisations bilaterally and through events like this. And in all of those, we're hearing a real range of conversations. So I've heard some chief execs say, actually, do you know what? We haven't had anyone ring up and ask us for any kind of repairs in the past 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Are we actually doing too much in the sort of routine repair space? You know, we're going out and screwing in kitchen cabinets and changing light bulbs, to caricature. Should we be actually pulling back and reimagining what our repair service looks like? Others saying, actually, we've actually become much closer to our tenants. We've got to know our tenants much better during this period, because actually we've been ringing particularly our vulnerable tenants up on a fairly regular basis to check in, make sure they're okay, try and help them, you know, deal with some of this crisis. It's really changed the way we have our relationship with our tenants. And so we're seeing a wide range of responses to that. And I think there will be a debate. And I think the white paper, if and when it arrives, will play into that discussion as well about what is that right relationship between landlords and tenants, and what does that mean for people who are housed in social housing and the future of social housing. So I think there is going to be quite a large discussion. We're trying to imagine what the parameters of that debate will be without necessarily wanting to have a view that it should be X or Y.
Right. Well, I mean, in that vein, I don't know if it's preempting you coming naturally to it. We've got Mark Granfield saying, what is the conversation about consumer regulation at the moment, and indeed tenant engagement during this era of lack of face-to-face contact? I guess it just plays in where we might be going with consumer regulation.
Yeah, so again, we've been talking to the national tenant organisations fairly regularly, as well as landlords and landlord organisations. and they sort of observe a real mix again of both what tenants want and the different types of services that landlords are offering. So I think some landlords, as I say, have actually been working really hard to talk to their vulnerable tenants, and we've certainly seen sort of some staff, frontline staff, being redeployed into call centres or working from home, but their job is changed from direct maintenance into maybe ringing up people in the patch they were on, checking they're okay, helping maybe with shopping or and that kind of outreach piece has been fairly active amongst some landlords. So some of the NTO said that for the first 2 or 3 weeks, landlords didn't have general contact with tenants, so all the kind of tenant scrutiny mechanisms, all the kind of meetings got pulled in lots of landlords. But what people have observed over the last 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe a little bit longer, is that those things have started coming back. And actually, one thing we're hearing from landlords is because they're doing everything digitally now, and possibly because everyone's, or not everyone, but lots more people are at home, is when they've been holding tenant scrutiny events or inviting tenants to join virtual meetings, they've been getting much wider participation in those events than they would do normally. And that's leading a lot of people to think, actually, in the future, that digital channel that perhaps we haven't gone down because we are concerned our elderly or vulnerable residents wouldn't engage with it, because people have sort of been forced to over the last 6 weeks. Everyone has kind of got tech savvy enough to do events like this and elsewhere. And there's lots of comments more broadly that the whole country has jumped forward 10 years in terms of technical and flexible working and technical engagement. And actually, that coming out of this, those digital channels will be more natural both for tenants to use and for landlords to use, and therefore get a much better engagement. So I think operationally we're seeing a variety of things, but I think some really encouraging signs of that landlord-tenant stuff. On the kind of white paper piece and what the government might want future consumer regulation, I think before we, or as coronavirus was beginning to hit, but before we hit lockdown, I think the really strong expectation was the white paper would have been out in April or May. So I think by now we would have had the white paper and we'd be into the what does it mean? And I think the question now is, and I'm not sensing any reduction in political interest in publishing the white paper when the time is right. The question is, when is the right time? And clearly publishing it this week, it wouldn't get any traction or any notice. So one of the questions for the government is, when will be the right time to publish? My guess would be that that's probably later on this year rather than later on this month, but that is speculation rather than even informed speculation. Because I think the government will want, but you can see how government will want at some point to have a kind of post-coronavirus narrative about how the world and society is changing, and a white paper around consumer regulation or a white paper around social housing tenants and the government's offer to them, you can see could easily form part of that post-coronavirus narrative about where the country is going and how we look after the most vulnerable in the country, which has clearly been a big theme of the last 6 to 8 weeks. So I've heard 1 or 2 people say, well, coronavirus means the white paper debate is over, and I think that's just complete nonsense. I'm absolutely confident the white paper will emerge in some form, but whether government will want to reflect on, does it want to change what it was planning on saying in the white paper in the light of experience of coronavirus, or does it think actually what was there is fit for purpose and it just wants to get on and deliver it? Those are all the types of debates that need to happen first, I think, before we see a white paper, which is why I think it'll be later on this year rather than later on this month.
Right. Would I be right in thinking, though, that the ink's pretty much dry on it? I mean, I know things were being finalised back in March. Are you in a position to give us a bit of a sneak peek?
No, it's really hard to say. I mean, what we were saying in March was expect much stronger consumer regulation.
Yeah.
The white paper covered a range of things, but one of the big things in it, and something very clear to my heart, is what does it mean for regulation and the landlord-tenant relationship?
Yeah.
I think the white paper is based on the premise that, and it was in the green paper, that lots of landlords and tenants engage really well, and lots of tenants feel really involved and empowered in their landlord, but many don't, and that many feel that when things go wrong, their landlord isn't as interested in solving their problem as they should be. And therefore there needs to be both a cultural change in parts of the sector to get everyone behaving in the way that the best do, but that cultural change needs to be supplemented by regulatory change. And I think that speaks to a much more proactive consumer regulator. Now, you'll be aware there's been debate about whether that should be the existing economic regulator having its role expanded, or whether that's a new consumer regulator just focused on those issues, and we'll need to see what's in the white paper. I think there are very strong arguments in favour of simplicity and having just one regulator so that tenants know that's the person I go to. But I also think there'll be quite a lot in there about the ombudsman and the role of the ombudsman, because for a lot of tenants, it's actually it's not necessarily systemic how my landlord behaves. It's the fact that this repair went badly wrong and nobody was interested in the fact, I still didn't have heating 6 weeks after the repair was meant to have been carried out, and nobody seems interested in sorting it out. That's the sort of, and that's the role of the ombudsman, dealing with those kind of individual things. But expect, I think, more robust, more muscular consumer regulation, whether it's carried out by us or by somebody else, and proactive. So rather than a regulator waiting for things to go wrong and those being reported to us, a regulator that's out looking for how landlords are doing and proactively following up where there are problems.
Right. Okay. Thanks for that. Just I'll try and rattle through some of these other questions. I know you're not the DWP, but Angela from the West Country is asking, have you got wind that there might be a chance that the bedroom tax might go as we consider more home working and the need for gardens?
Ooh, I've not heard that discussion. Most of the discussions we've had either with or about BWP have been about the focus on just keeping the UC system going. Just from a practical point of view, 2 million new applications going into universal credit is just a massive systems challenge. So I think a lot of DWP's focus has been on processing and dealing with those 2 million complaints, to the extent that policy officials in DWP have been drafted into being retrained as claimant handlers, because it's just been all hands to the pump in terms of dealing with the surge of UC claimants. So I think some of those wider policy debates haven't happened as quickly as they might, but again, it's all part of that kind of post-coronavirus world.
Right, thanks for that. And Sunil down in Brighton is just wondering if there might be any additional regulation in the pipeline to house the homeless.
I'm not sure whether it will be regulation. So one of the very active debates in government at the moment is, the homeless have, by and large, it's variable, by and large have been rehoused in emergency accommodation, hotels, hostels, all sorts of places. And as we emerge from lockdown, what I don't think anybody wants to see is 10,000 homeless people just turfed back out onto the street again. So there's a very active debate in government, and I think between government and parts of the sector and those local authorities, is how do you decant the people from the accommodation they're in into something that will support them to avoid being back on the street subsequently. And I think that's a really big challenge. And just politically, I think the government would be judged quite harshly if it just turfed out 10,000 homeless people. I think it knows, and it wants to try and find a longer term, use this crisis as an opportunity to find a long-term solution. I apologise if you can hear hoovering on in the background. I'm sorry, it's not.
Yeah, I think we've all got a bit of that, or partners wandering by in their dressing gowns, that kind of stuff. Right, just last question on this from Fiona at Providence Row Housing Association. I might have to read this one because it's a bit of a longer one. When there is a relaxation of lockdown, there'll still be massive logistical issues, especially with PPE and public transport. And these may make providing supported housing services even more difficult and costly. Is there an understanding that this will continue to be a serious challenge operationally and financially for some time to come for supported housing providers? Right. Are you there, Jonathan?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I've taken the opportunity of that question to move about in the house. So I'm now away from the Hoover and the children. So hopefully that's a bit better. But yes, so this issue about PPE is a really serious one, because we know from speaking to supported housing organisations, as I was saying earlier, security of supply of PPE has been really difficult to maintain over the past sort of 6 to 8 weeks. And we've had lots of stories of people who've procured their own PPE only to have it requisitioned at the last minute by the NHS. yeah, everyone completely understands, why that's happening, but it has made running care and support operations really difficult in that period. And yes, we are aware, and I have a daily meeting along with Fiona, with senior officials at the department, where we're feeding in all the intelligence we've gathered during the day and talking about the issues. And we talk about every day we talk about PPE. And over the last week or so, we've been talking quite a lot about this challenge, that if on Monday or Sunday there is an announcement that everyone should try and get back to work, but you've got to wear PPE on public transport, what that would do to the PPE supply chain, would make the challenges 10 times worse. So government is definitely aware of that as a risk issue, and it needs to think quite hard about how it maintains PPE supply chains in that context. So I don't have a definitive answer, but I can assure you that the government has clocked that risk, and it's something that people are raising with us on a regular basis, and we're engaging with the department on. I mean, when the history of this crisis gets to be told, the place of PPE and PPE supplies is going to have a central place in that story, and I think we haven't got to the end of the chapter to overextend the metaphor on that. I still think there are real challenges around that, and we haven't cracked it. Personal view, I don't think we've cracked it enough yet to say everyone should be out with PPE, as part of a way of mitigating the impact of social distancing. But goodness, those are hard, tough choices for government to have to make.
Right. Yeah, but the point is, as a regulator, you're alive to those financial and service-related pressures that the housing sector.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, we just had one more come in, which I think would be worth airing, and it's about smaller housing associations specifically, which is the audience here. Yes, there is a recognition amongst the regulator and the government about the benefit, particularly of smaller housing associations, in being able to respond to their tenants' needs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, there was a clear understanding that small community-based local organisations have a really important role to play, and I don't think anyone wants to lose those benefits. And I think government gets that completely. Steve, you've heard me say this a million times. Politicians are quite capable of thinking two different thoughts simultaneously. So they're quite capable of thinking what we want is community-based small housing associations that are close to their customers, but we also want a large, efficient, big organisations with significant financial muscle able to build lots of homes, and they're quite capable of holding both of those thoughts in their head at the same time, which the rest of us can't do. So there will always be some challenges about, if you're small, are you efficient? Is that the best use of those assets? But I think there's also a very strong narrative that politicians get that small community-based organisations bring real value that you don't get if you're a large national organisation. So they get that, but that doesn't, I think, negate the need for small organisations to constantly tell the story about what it is that they add and what it is that they bring, and you might need to just keep telling that story over and over again.
And I'd be remiss without sort of pointing out that certainly according to the stats that we capture for all of our members, is that they, notwithstanding the fact that they're quite small, they're pretty damn efficient, and certainly very, very effective when compared to the larger associations as well. Yeah. So with that in mind, I suppose the other half of Maureen's question is, do you imagine that might ever sort of translate into the availability of perhaps more funding finding its way targeted to smaller associations?
I mean, that would be a question for Homes England rather than for us. I mean,
right.
I think there is a real interest in small and community-led organisations, both politically and at Homes England and the GLA. So I think it's an active discussion. It always comes up against the fact that delivery organisations have got big targets to meet, and the easiest way to get into big targets, not the best way, the easiest way often is to do a series of 10 big deals rather than 100 medium-sized deals on funding, and I think that can be a challenge for smaller organisations accessing that funding. So I wouldn't want to say there's an easy answer to this, but I think also, but there is, absolutely there is. We hear it quite a lot in engagement with ministers and senior officials. There is a real interest in community-led organisations and what they can do and the difference that can make at a local level.
Brilliant. Okay, right. We're up to date with all our questions. I know you've got back-to-back meetings. You're kind of Zooming all day. We've got 10 minutes left. Did you want to crack through some of the things that you really wanted to box off?
So yes, and thanks, Steve. I mean, just the other thing I wanted to put on people's radar that we are really worrying about is the kind of, so there's been a kind of immediate, how is the sector coping today? And then there's the kind of, what does the post-coronavirus world look like? But who quite knows when that post-coronavirus world will start? Which, you know, it might be after a vaccine is universally available sometime in, let's hope, 2021. But it might be slightly further out than that. But there is this kind of intermediate period where we're going to have to, it seems like we're going to have to learn to live with the virus, but not in the deep freeze that we're in currently, because frankly the government and the nation can't afford the furlough scheme indefinitely, and it's just not viable to have half the population sat at home not working. But how you emerge from that and the consequences of that sort of medium-term picture, sort of next 6 to 12 months, that looks to us to be the bit that we're most worried about now as a regulator, because one of the things that's happened for housing associations is that there might have been some problems with income. They might not be able to sell properties like in the way that they expected, but they've actually also really struggled to spend money. So we've got a number of organisations saying to us, actually, because we can't do any of our planned repairs and we're not doing any responsive repairs, and we've pulled back on all discretionary expenditure on other things, we're actually, you know, we're almost an enforced saver at the moment. But there will come a point where you have to start spending that money. But that might also be the point where the furlough scheme is being lifted and people who are currently employed might become unemployed because those businesses don't have a long-term future, and when government support's withdrawn, people are made redundant. But the repairs backlog starts to need to be caught up with. Tenant expectations are that these things are being dealt with, but that you're going to have to be dressed in very expensive PPE to go in and do it. So and I'm a regulator, so it's my job to worry about what's the worst thing that's going to happen. And the worst thing for me that's going to happen is income for housing associations start going down because of those issues around people losing their job, and the benefit system taking a little while to catch up. The housing market staying in deep freeze because nobody wants to buy or sell in the current context. And the funding market's being shut, but all of a sudden repairs are being carried out. They're more expensive to carry out because you've got to suit up all your operatives in gear to do it. It all takes much longer because you're still having to observe social distancing rules. So a repair that would normally take an hour is now taking 3 hours. You're only doing 2 of those a day, not 6 a day. All of those types of practical questions that ends up costing you far more to do the work that you're planning to do. Plus you're having to spend all the money you haven't been able to spend now because that's the tenant expectation. And you can just see there might be some kind of crunch at that point. On the other hand, you might still have tenants saying, I don't want anyone in my house for months to come because of concerns about the spread of coronavirus and a second wave. So we just don't quite know what that medium-term picture looks like. But as the government withdraws support from individuals and from companies, it might just become a little bit more difficult for associations to trade in that period. So we're doing quite a lot of thinking at the moment. Not just what does the sort of longer-term post-coronavirus assessment look like, but what does the lifting of lockdown looks like, and what happens if that's done in a variety of different ways, whether it's done lockdown is lifted just for everyone, whether it's done by economic sectors, whether it's done by demography, whether it's done by geography. There's a whole range of ways that government could choose to lift the lockdown, and those will play out differentially, I think, for housing associations. So we're going through that thought process, and I'd hope that some, the boards and organisations are not spending every hour of every day thinking about that, but that somewhere people are beginning just to plan for a range of different scenarios for the lifting of lockdown, and potentially the lifting and then the reimposition. So just putting that on people's radars, that we think that's an important thing with all the myriad of other things people are worrying about at the moment. That is something I think people should be actively trying to think about and plan for. Well,
if it gives you some reassurance, I've been hosting tons of regional and specialist club meetings on Zoom. And I'd say for at least the last 3 to 4 weeks, members have been sort of planning their coronavirus exit strategies. And yeah, going through those kinds of scenarios, just as you said. Yes, can I just put a few more questions to you? Because we've only got a few minutes left. I'm conscious of it. Yeah, just from Craig up at Leeds, where we've talked about gas servicing, just thinking about some of the other health and safety stuff where the regs aren't quite so prescriptive, such as asbestos and electrical. Have you got a view on organisations' performance around boxing those tasks off?
So, I mean, you may have seen, or you may not have had a chance yet, but we've published the results of our first cause survey. So this is the survey we're carrying out monthly, and the sector is telling us that those kind of sort of, I think Legionella is slightly different. I mean, I think where that is an issue for you, where you've got those sort of communal systems, that remains as important as ever. And I think there's less scope, if you like, with Legionella to be not carrying out that work, even though all the other caveats apply about the ability to do that in these difficult circumstances. People are telling us that on things like some of the electrical testing, they are I can't quite work out which way the risk appetite is going, but they are changing their risk appetite. So whereas perhaps you might go in and do those checks every 5 years, if it's the 5th year now, you're kind of saying, well, if we wait another year before we go in and do those checks, that probably is reasonable. And where people are flexing like that, we think that's fine, as long as you've got, again, it comes back to, have you got a logic and a rationale for why you've done what you've done, and not just going, oh, it's all too difficult, we're not going to think about it. So I'm sure no one's doing, but if there is ever an inquest, if something does go wrong in one of your properties, and it won't necessarily just be us, it might be the HSE, it might be the local authority, it might be a whole range of statutory organisations that then worry about, well, why did that happen? You need to have some kind of logical defence. Actually, we as an organisation took a sensible decision that, based on the balance of probabilities and risks, this was a reasonable thing to do. It turned out that it led to this consequence, but it was a reasonable decision for the board or the executive team to have made at the time. And that will always be your best defence. Should something tragically go wrong, where people will try and point a finger at you, I think. So it's about having gone through that thought process and being able to document it. That's the really important thing, I think, at the moment.
Thank you. And again, from Mark Jackson down Lambeth Way, it's yes, your point about spending and the fact that some organisations are actually saving cash now because of their planned and they're responsive. It's likely to result in higher surpluses. Will you be managing government expectations? Because we've been here before about balance sheets and surpluses and why aren't they spending? Presumably you'll be managing that message back to government.
We will. We certainly will try, and we do that. We do that every year. I have the scars to prove it. I mean, I think that there are questions for associations as well about what you can do to manage that. And certainly, I've been involved in some very active, or been a witness to active discussions in webinars where people are talking to each other. And there is, I think there are all sorts of views about what people might do as a result of that. So, for example, some organisations have chosen not to access the furlough scheme, although they may have furloughed some of their staff. They're meeting their costs from their own resources because they don't feel it's appropriate to access the furlough scheme. Some organisations have accessed the furlough scheme because they think it's entirely the appropriate thing to do, and those are decisions, I think, for individual boards and organisations. Others are saying they're increasing their contribution to their, if they have a charitable foundation or a hardship fund, or so they may be repurposing some of that money to find ways to support tenants. So not foregoing rent cuts, rent increases, or offering rent holidays to tenants, but increasing that sort of exceptional and special support they give to some of their tenants. And so people, there is an active discussion, I think, recognising that as an issue. But what is the right thing for what are often charitable philanthropic organisations to be doing in that context? And you can see how the optics of increasing chief exec pay for having managed the risk so successfully will look quite poor, whereas increasing your support for hard up tenants will actually probably play quite well. And those decisions will be down to individual boards, but I think having that sense of how will others looking in, and not just central government, but your tenants, your partners, your local authority partners, as well as central government and the regulator. What, how will this look to the man on or the woman on the street, if you like? And I think that's an important exercise for boards to go through when they're thinking about those issues.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. We're right up to our appointed time there, quite neatly. Thanks so much for making the time.
It's all my pleasure.
To talk to our members. I'm sure they found it super useful, especially, again, notwithstanding the fact that it was recorded, your frankness, transparency, candor, as always, just really, really useful.
You always worry when you use words like that, Steve. I'm gonna...
I hope you'll be back as well.
I'd be really happy to. If the situation carries on, if you want me to come back and talk to your members, really happy to do that.
That would be brilliant. I'm sure they'd value it. So yes, just remains for me to say thanks to everybody for listening in. We really hope it was useful. We will be sending you a feedback form. Please fill it in. It'll also include a link to our other webinars, so get yourself signed up for those. So that's it. Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks, Jonathan.
No, thanks, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.